Welcome to TORAH Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 50, Acts chapter 17. The Rabbi cross-examines the New Testament. Tonight with Rabbi Michael Skobac from, the Holy Land of Canada. Hey, it's holy because you're there. Just know that, okay? That's a straight new coin for me. How's that? Oh man, wow, that's really cool.
50 shows.
Yeah, this is our 50th anniversary, and like you said, you didn't buy me flowers or anything, man.
Oh, okay. You know what? When we hit 100, I'll get you some chocolate.
That sounds good to me. My wife will probably confiscate it, but that's okay. It's the thought that counts. Oh my gosh! Wow. Well, it's good to have you back. I'm excited to see you here. And what better time than right now, tentatively, just for all the viewers out there to be aware, for about the next 5 weeks or so, I'm not going to be doing an evening slot on Sunday, so we'll be gathering again with Rabbi Michael Skobac probably around the second week of October, right? Yeah, because September. Yeah, so about the second week of October. Just stay tuned. I'll touch base on you, let you know kind of how the schedule's going. It should loosen up right around that time frame. So just keep that in mind. So next week and probably for the next 4 to 6 weeks is probably not going to have a late night Sunday show. So, and I'm going to be crying more than Rabbi will because I'm going to be missing him.
Miss you too.
That's awesome. I just want to be loved by you. I know that was terrible. That's okay. Oh, goodness gracious. Wow. Well, all right. So what do you got for us, Rabbi?
So Acts 17.
Acts 17. Yes, sir, indeed. It is indeed.
Boy, that means we're getting past the midway of this book. And
nice.
It's getting, yeah. And it's going to get really, really, really cool as we get towards the 20s.
Right.
So last week we had this really interesting episode of Timothy being circumcised, and we had a whole discussion about why exactly he was circumcised. Was it because, God has an eternal covenant with the Jewish people that has to be sealed through the circumcision of men? And we saw that really, according to literally every single commentary we consulted, that wasn't the reason Paul circumcised him. It was because, he felt that
I apologize. Let me turn this off. I apologize. I usually turn my ringer all the way off during this.
Is that your phone?
That was my phone. Yeah, it's
popular guy.
Yeah, all at the wrong times.
So
Okay.
We saw that Paul's concern was that it would hinder his effectiveness in witnessing to the Jewish community if his comrade in arms was not circumcised.
Right.
Anyway, the story begins in Acts 17 when they're in Thessalonica, which is in Greece, and as far as I understand, and Paul, we know, he teaches in Romans chapter 1, I think it's verse 16, that the gospel is supposed to go to the Jew first, and then to the Greeks.
Right.
So, number one, it was his stated policy, and we know that we see in every single story, whenever Paul comes to a city where there is a synagogue, Paul first does try to go to the Jewish community first. So here in Thessalonica, he goes to the synagogue of the Jews, and we're told that he went for 3 consecutive Sabbaths, 3 Shabbats in a row, and he was basically preaching from the scriptures, trying to prove that Jesus was the Messiah who was supposed to be raised from the dead. Now, it's important not to miss this. The fact that he was able to return 3 weeks in a row and continuing to preach says something. What it says is that nothing in his message was scandalous. And that's important because we've had this ongoing problem in the gospel that we study, the Gospel of Matthew, and also in the book of Acts up until this point, where there's an ongoing attempt to make it seem as if, there's something scandalous about what Jesus was and what he was preaching and what Paul was preaching, and that, you have many chapters we've seen where they try to portray the Jewish community, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as, being violently opposed, to Jesus and to the followers of Jesus. We're in the Gospels, there are, all these attempts to kill Jesus and pursue him and persecute him. And the same thing continues in the book of Acts, where there are many times where the book of Acts where Luke tries to tell us that there was tremendous persecution. And yet at the same time, there were these mixed messages, because several times already we've seen that Paul is able to preach and no one seems to bat an eyelash. And so here you have the same significant situation, that he's able to go back to the synagogue for 3 Shabbats in a row, and no one seems to be particularly bothered by what he's saying, which really would be the truth. For someone to come into synagogue and say that they believe that so-and-so is the Messiah and try to present arguments for that from the Bible, that would not really be so scandalous. And so I think that's what was happening. I think that, for Paul to be able to preach unencumbered and unopposed, he would be teaching nothing that would be, it would be strange, because Jesus was dead, and, the idea that he was the Messiah would have been strange to people, but it would not have been heretical. It would not have been scandal. No one would have picked up stones and chased him out. And that's what we see here. We see that he, there were no riots to kill him in this synagogue. And so again, what the reader has to be aware of is that there's a contradiction here. That on the one hand, there are many stories where the Jewish people are violently opposed to the gospel, to Jesus, to the gospel message, to the disciples of Jesus, and yet you have so many passages where nothing seems to be a problem. Everything seems to be cool, and there doesn't seem to be any real hostility to Jesus and his movement. And so the question is, which of these scenarios is true? And I would say, based upon, we began looking at in the Passion narratives, that there was a clear agenda by many of the writers, many of the compilers and authors of the Greek Testament, to try, if they could, paint the Jewish people in a negative light, to give the impression that they were the ones that were really opposed to Jesus and hostile to Jesus, and where the Roman involvement and Roman opposition and hostility is really played down. And so I would imagine that, most of the stories of violent opposition were simply not true. They just were written into the account. And so here, it's interesting that Paul is preaching that Jesus is the Messiah and that he had to be suffer and be resurrected. There's no what's interesting is that he doesn't explicitly say here that he had to suffer in order to be a sacrifice to atone for anyone's sins. Now, again, we've looked at this question many times in our study of Acts. What exactly was Paul preaching? Was he simply preaching that Jesus was the Messiah? Was he teaching that Jesus died as a sacrifice? Was he teaching that Jesus was God? So you clearly don't see the last two in this chapter. He's just simply preaching that Jesus was the Messiah, that he had to suffer. It doesn't explain what the suffering was to accomplish. We might suppose, because we know from later writings of Paul, that Paul definitely did believe that Jesus came to suffer as an atoning sacrifice, but he doesn't spell it out here. At least Luke, in his writing of this story, doesn't spell it out. And clearly what he doesn't teach here, and this is very significant because we've seen this ongoing throughout the book of Acts so far, is that no one is preaching that Jesus is God. No one is preaching that Jesus should be worshipped as divine, should be prayed to and worshipped and is God, etc. So again, that would be one of the reasons why his message would not have been such a scandal here. Just to say that Jesus was the Messiah is not the end of the world. It wouldn't be a crime in Judaism to say such a thing. To say that he was God would have been a problem, and he would have been opposed, and he wouldn't have been allowed to come back 3 weeks in a row and preach, but he didn't preach that. We see that very clearly here. Now, one of the questions that I would ask is, it says that he was reasoning from the scriptures to prove that Jesus was the Messiah who was supposed to suffer and be raised from the dead. I would be curious as to know what scriptures he was pointing to. What was his brief? What was his argument from the scriptures? How did he actually prove it? It's tantalizing, and it's sort of teasing us, but it doesn't tell you. We don't get any clue as to what Paul was saying. Most of the commentaries to this chapter say that he would have been quoting Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, and Psalm 16, which they allege speaks about the resurrection of the Messiah. We'll refer to those in a few minutes, but I would have been happier if Luke had given us some clue here as to what exactly Paul was preaching. So we have to just use our imaginations. So we saw initially that no one seems to be terribly agitated about what Paul was doing, but then we're told that in verse 4 that some of the people were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, these are the God-fearers, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. And so as soon as people start responding to Paul's message, that's when all hell breaks loose. And so in verse 5 we're told that the Jews who were not persuaded by Paul became envious, or becoming envious. Now, I think we have to stop for a minute and ask ourselves, what is this all about? What does it mean they were envious? Envious of what? That he was such a good preacher? They didn't like the fact that he was able to sound good when he was preaching.
Drawing the crowds.
Yeah, why were they so upset about him drawing crowds? I mean, if what he was saying wasn't a problem, so who cares if people follow him? The Tyndale New Testament commentary says that they were jealous that Paul was more successful than the synagogue's efforts for these God-fearers to fully embrace Judaism. Now, this is a pretty peculiar commentary, because what it seems to be implying is that the Gentiles that were coming to this synagogue, they were evangelized by the synagogue, that the synagogue was trying to encourage them to embrace Judaism, to get circumcised, to convert to Judaism, to fulfill all the commandments, and they weren't able to. And yet Paul was able to get them to join his Messianic movement, and that's why they were jealous. Of course, the problem with this commentary is that it was very unlikely that the synagogue was pressuring these Gentiles that were coming to convert. There is no such concept in Judaism of encouraging non-Jews to convert. Actually, the opposite is the case. We see, based upon the book of Ruth, that Naomi 3 times discouraged Ruth from joining her and joining the Jewish people. So it was not something that the synagogue would have done to try and encourage these God-fearers to convert. They were very happy to have these Noachites, these God-fearers, just attending the synagogue and being righteous Gentiles. So that clearly is not why these Jewish people were becoming envious. The English Standard Version Study Bible, the ESV Study Bible, says that, and this is a very, very common accusation, not just in the New Testament, but even by later Christian thinkers, that the real problem was that the Jews were losing power. And with the loss of power, there was a loss of money. That really what was bothering these people was they were losing their power, their influence, their prestige, and their financial gains. If you go back to chapter 5 of Acts in verse 17, so there we're told that the high priest, the leader of the Sadducees, became very jealous and envious. And the commentaries say there that he was afraid of losing his power and his influence. And then we just saw, I think, in chapter 13, we had that the Jews in Antioch, the synagogue in Antioch, were told they became jealous when the God-fearers began to follow Paul. And again, it's the same story here. And this is very important just to remember that what does not bother them is the substance of what Paul was preaching. What seems to be bothering them is that some of their members are going to be going elsewhere. They're going to lose the members. So this is a common theme throughout a lot of anti-Jewish teaching in Christian sources, that was the whole problem, they say, that the Jewish people had with Jesus, that they saw him as threatening their influence, their power, their prestige, their authority, because he was challenging all of that. I think that's really incorrect. I don't think Jesus was challenging their authority so much, because essentially I believe Jesus was teaching the same thing they were teaching, which is to follow the Torah. So it's not so clear what it means here in verse 5 that the Jews who were not persuaded by Paul all of a sudden after 3 weeks now become very envious. And so they get a mob together and they get the whole city upset. I mean, they really go pretty crazy here. And they attack the house of someone named Jason and they bring him out to the people. What they're upset about is, in verse 6, they specifically explain, when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down." Now he's referring here to followers of Jesus, and they're describing the followers of Jesus as people who've turned the whole world upside down. That's obviously an exaggeration. At this point in the history of Christianity, it wasn't a worldwide movement. But what they seem to be saying is that there was something about Christians that were disturbing to the authorities. And again, it's not to the Jewish authorities here. This is really where a little bit of truth comes out, right? They were acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, that being Jesus. So here's one of those places in the New Testament where the truth sort of sneaks out. And this is really the problem at hand. The problem with Jesus was not that he was causing any scandal within the Jewish community. The problem was that if he was claiming to be Messiah, that means he's claiming to be the king of the Jews. And that would only bother the Romans. That would only bother the people who were claiming that they were the ones that had authority. They were the ones that were in charge. And the Romans did not take kindly to anyone who claimed that, no, the Romans are not the ones that are to be ruling. You know, we have someone else that's going to be ruling. So it's pretty clear that the concern about Paul's preaching was that he seemed to be calling for an overthrow of the emperor. So the people here in Thessalonica, what concerns them is that they have this presence in their city of troublemakers, that the Romans probably, wouldn't bother the people in this town, except for the fact that now in their midst is a radical, is a revolutionary, is someone that's proclaiming that, no, the Caesar is not the king. We have our king, it's Jesus. And so this is really, the truth of what's going on here in these stories. And it's really the truth of what happened in the Gospels. But again, what the New Testament generally tries to do is give the impression that, no, this was not a political problem between the Jesus movement and the Romans. This was a religious problem between Jesus and the Jewish community. But again, you see constantly throughout the Gospels that Jesus didn't do anything that was so controversial. And again, Paul here you see preaching in the synagogues for weeks, saying nothing that's controversial. And so again, there's this tension where the New Testament is stuck. It's trying to present these stories in a way that fit their agenda, and the truth does not fit their agenda. So here it really sort of slips out. The truth really slips out here of what was really going on. So they go, and the story is that Paul and Silas end up leaving Thessalonica, and they go to Berea. And here a very interesting story is told. Told when they arrived in Berea, they went into the synagogue of the Jews again. They go right to the synagogue. Again, we mentioned earlier that it's sort of redundant to say synagogue of the Jews. The Gentiles didn't have synagogues. So it's sort of a strange expression, as if almost separating themselves from the Jewish community. If they were really part of the Jewish community, they just would have gone to the synagogue, like all Jews do. So it seems to be speaking about the Jews as a group different than who they are. And these were told by the way, I just should, if you don't mind, just make one interesting observation.
Of course. That
the chapter begins by saying, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. Now in chapter 16, the word that was used was we, because there Luke was writing as if Luke was part of the story. He was on the scene. And now in chapter 17, Luke disappears, and he's not part of the story anymore, and it's they, right? So it's very strange that Luke seems to drop in and out of these stories. So they arrived in the synagogue of the Jews of Berea, and in verse 11 we're told that these were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica. Obviously, Luke is implying that the Jews who were stubborn and envious in Thessalonica never really gave Paul a fair hearing. But here the Jews were told are fair-minded and that they received the word with all readiness, meaning they apparently listened carefully to what Paul was preaching, and they searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. So not only did they listen carefully to Paul's sermons, but they spent the entire week. Didn't say here that they searched the scriptures on the Sabbath. They spent every day going through the Bible to see whether or not what Paul was teaching made any sense. And we're told here that not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men, were there as well. And many of them believed. So in verse 12 we're told that many of these Jews in Berea who carefully searched the scriptures, they were obviously very studious people. They were normally people that took the Bible very seriously. They listened to Paul's arguments and they came to believe. Now, let's just pause for a second and think what this is saying. It's saying that Paul had scriptures from the Tanakh, because there was no New Testament at this point. So Paul had scriptures from the Tanakh that he presented to these people, and these learned, studious people at Berea, they were impressed with Paul's arguments, and they came to accept Jesus as the Messiah and everything else that Paul was preaching. So I would say that this is very unlikely. It's very unlikely that Paul was able to convince learned people who were studious that Jesus was the Messiah and that he had to suffer and die and be resurrected. All of these beliefs, it was unlikely that he convinced these people in Berea for a number of reasons. Number one, Paul, we're told, was a learned person. He was claiming to have been a student of Gamliel, and any student of Gamliel was an advanced Talmud class, so you would have known the Tanakh, the scriptures, very well. So the question is, why didn't these scriptures have any impact on Paul before he had his Damascus experience? Meaning that if Paul has these powerful scripture verses in the Tanakh proving that Jesus was the Messiah, so why was Paul persecuting the followers of Jesus? Paul was apparently a learned person. He would have known these verses in the Tanakh. So how clear could they have been?
That is a really good point, because none of his knowledge is what got him there. It's some vision so that's really excellent point.
So how clear are these verses? Let's say, for example, it doesn't exist, but let's say that he found a verse, right, somewhere, let's say in the prophet Zephaniah, which says, Jesus is going to come one day, Yeshua is going to come, and he's going to be the Messiah who will suffer and die and be resurrected. So that might have been the kind of verse he would show the Bereans, and they would say, wow, Paul's got a good point there. But didn't Paul know that verse?
Right.
And if he did, why would he persecute the followers of Jesus?
Right.
So that's one thing to bear in mind. Secondly, today, we know these lists of proof texts that Christians use. Some people claim there are dozens of passages in the Tanakh that prove that Jesus was the Messiah who was supposed to suffer and die and be resurrected. Some people claim there are over 365. Some people claim there are over 600. I mean, there are incredible claims for these alleged prophecies in the Tanakh proving that Jesus was the Messiah. But how clear are they when, if you consult the commentaries of many Christian scholars don't accept them as either being, let's say, messianic prophecies or about Jesus? For example, the most powerful proof text, the one that the Christian commentaries here in Acts 17 cite, they all claim that Paul would have showed them Isaiah 53. But if Isaiah 53 is so clearly about the Messiah and so clearly about Jesus, then why would there be so many Christian commentaries today? I've found in my research, over 60. So over 60, and that's, I think, where there's smoke, there's fire. I mean, I don't have access to every Christian commentary, but I found 60 commentaries of Christian scholars, Bible scholars, who claim that the book of Isaiah chapter 53 is not about the Messiah. They say it's about the people of Israel.
Right.
And they say it's not about Jesus. It's about the people of Israel. So, how persuasive would these passages be with scholarly Jews like these students in Berea? It's interesting that today what we find is that scholarly Jews, knowledgeable Jews, Jews who grew up studying the Tanakh and learning it well, invariably these are people that never embrace Christianity when they're shown verses by Christian friends or neighbors or missionaries. And the kind of people who do end up embracing Christianity are Jews that never studied the Bible in the first place. They never were familiar with the Bible, and usually the first time they've read the Bible is when it's shown to them by a Christian.
Mm-hmm, right.
So, I have met many Jewish people who tell me, they share their testimony, and they tell me that, yeah, they became a Christian because of what they saw in, passages like Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 and Psalm 22. And I know that it's just basically never true, because I know that if I had met this Jewish person a week before they gave their hearts to Jesus, and I saw them in a McDonald's, and I asked them, it says here in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy that you can't eat this food, it's not kosher. I know that none of them would have thrown up and left the McDonald's and said, wow, I can't believe it, I'm eating this. Because we have to understand that for the most part, Jewish people today that embrace Christianity were never Jewish people who took the Bible seriously and really believed what the Bible said. If you had shown them verses in the Bible showing what foods are kosher and what foods are not kosher, they would say, who cares what the Bible says? And if you ask them, did they put on phylacteries in the morning? The Bible says to tie them as a sign upon your arm and at frontlets between your eyes. And if you ask them, did you do that today? The Bible says to do it. They would say, who cares? I don't care what the Bible says. So therefore, that when they tell you they came to believe in Jesus because of what it says in Isaiah, that's not the truth. It's not the truth. These are people that didn't really care what the Bible said. Yeah.
Furthermore, in Acts chapter, in Acts 53, I think 9, the second half of it, where it says they speak no violence how does it say? There's no deception or whatever, and they have done no violence. But in Zephaniah 3:13 it says the exact same thing about the remnant of Israel. It says the remnant of Israel have done no violence, and there was no deceitful tongue found in their mouth or whatever. So it's like this is a question for me. Did Zephaniah? I'm not sure it really matters. I guess Zephaniah probably would have came. How do they fall in Isaiah, Zephaniah? Were they contemporaries? Do you know?
They were not too far apart in time.
Who was first? Do you know?
I do not know offhand. I would have to look that up.
Okay.
Who came out first? If I had to guess, I would say Isaiah, but I may be wrong.
Okay, no problem. I was just curious, but it's interesting that it says there. I mean, it's very clear. And back on Isaiah 53 too, or not 53 too, but 53 also, where it says it describes how Jesus was, or well, excuse me, yeah, it describes Jesus, right? Okay, it describes the tomb and the death there. This is the first part of 53:9. Let me just pull it up because it'll be easier for people to follow, and me as well. So let me go and just do that real fast. I'm slowing you down, I know. Let me just do this real fast. Isaiah 53:9. Okay, I'm going to put that on screen. That way I can read it. Pardon me. I'm right there. Okay. It says, and he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. That's the first half of it. And I'm thinking, what happened to Jesus was like just the opposite. I mean, because a grave is where you're buried. And in your death, that's the location of your death, right? Well, this says he was with the rich in his death. But he wasn't with the rich, according to the New Testament. He was with thieves, right?
Yeah, these are actually the least of Jesus's problems,
right?
I mean,
right.
we have Isaiah 53 saying that he will see his seed, he'll prolong his days, which means he's going to have physical children,
right?
And he'll live a very long life. And, it says in Isaiah that the servant of the Lord will be despised and rejected of men. Well, Jesus was, during his lifetime, we're told, immensely popular. And there weren't many people that opposed him. At the end of his life, you had for one day a courtyard full of people, allegedly, screaming for his execution. But he throughout the New Testament, we're told that he had people following him all over the place, and his fame spread throughout the whole region. And then after his death, he's certainly the most popular person in all of history. So, the whole chapter, if you go verse by verse, what did Johnny Cochran say in the O.J. Simpson trial? If the glove don't fit, you got to acquit.
Right.
Well, the glove don't fit. It's Isaiah 53 simply doesn't fit Jesus. And more importantly, aside from that, just understanding the context of the book of Isaiah and how the servant of the Lord is just explicitly spoken of as the people of Israel, and how the surrounding chapters, chapter 52 and 54, are about the suffering of Israel and their ultimate redemption. I mean, it's so powerful that this passage is about Israel, that it's not just Jewish people that understand it as speaking of Israel. Again, you have dozens and dozens and dozens of Christians that believe in Jesus, but they admit that the chapter is not about the Messiah, it's not about Jesus, it's about Israel, simply because the Bible points them in that direction. So I just find myself a little bit skeptical about the story that's being told here about these people in Berea. I mean, they may have been people who searched the Bible, but I don't think they were necessarily very knowledgeable or very scholarly, because we just see from today that Jews who are knowledgeable and really know the scriptures well are not people that come to faith in Jesus. By and large, almost all of them are people that simply never really seriously studied the Bible. And my belief is that they don't go from the Bible, from the Tanakh, to Jesus. They go from Jesus to the Tanakh, meaning that only once they become followers of Jesus, now for them the Bible becomes very important. But the Bible did not lead them to their faith in Jesus. Now, we'll finish tonight with the very interesting story of Paul addressing another kind of group, where it's not a group of traditional religious Jews, but now he's meeting up with in Athens now Greeks, basically pagans, and he's now going to preach to the Greeks, to these non-Jewish people. And it says in verse 23 that he was passing through and considered the objects of worship. He was looking at the things that these people in Greece were worshiping, and he says that he found an altar with this inscription. And the inscription was, "To the unknown God." Now, who is this referring to? So what Paul says is, therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. So Paul is basically saying to these people who, we know that the Greeks had a multitude of gods. They had a whole, uh, you know, their whole cosmic order was full of different gods and demigods, and they were not monotheists by any stretch of the imagination. And in one sense, what Paul seems to be saying here is, disingenuous, and really not even accurate. Meaning, he seems to be saying that the idolatry that they worship is really, if they really understood, it's the true God that Paul is preaching. I find it strange that Paul equates, the God that he's preaching, which probably is, from my understanding, the God of Israel. I think that Paul has not yet articulated a belief that Jesus is God. So he really is speaking about the Creator. And he says to these Greeks that the one who you worship without knowing, he's saying that even though you Greeks have all these different gods that you worship, he's saying really you're not aware of the fact that you're truly worshiping the Creator God of the world. Now that, I don't know. I don't know if that's really appropriate. If that's
Right.
if that's really ethical to do that, because does he really believe that these people are actually worshiping the Creator, even though they're worshiping these,
Right.
Greek gods and other kind of pagan worship? So it's hard to understand why he starts off his preaching with this, but he claims that he's proclaiming the God in verse 24 who made the world and everything in it. And he's really quoting here or paraphrasing from Isaiah chapter 42, from the book of Job chapter 10, from the book of Psalms chapter 36. I mean, he's going through this description of God who has made everyone from blood, every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. I mean, he's describing God here, basically. And he says in verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being. So he's ascribing everything to God. Also, he says, some of your own poets have said. And now he's contextualizing the gospel for these pagans, and he's quoting their own poets. And he says, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, Paul says, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, saying, don't get distracted by the idols that you have. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked. He seems to be trying to, downplay really the seriousness of their idolatry. But he says, Paul says, but now this God, the true God, commands all men everywhere to repent. All right, that's true. Everyone should repent because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness. That's true. God will judge the whole world. But then Paul throws in something that's problematic. He says that God is going to judge the whole world in righteousness through the man who he has ordained, which is obviously a reference to Jesus. So, first of all, we should say that, again, this makes it very clear that to Paul, Jesus is not God. He is a man that's been appointed, ordained by God. So, again, this is consistent with everything we've seen so far, that Paul has not been preaching the idea that Jesus is God, but the idea that God is going to judge the world through Jesus, or really through any person, is a little bit unusual, because that's not what the Tanakh says. Tanakh does never say that God is going to somehow judge the whole world by, some person or through some person. The Messiah will judge between people as a human king. We see that in the book of Isaiah. I think it's chapter 2, where the Messiah does judge between people. But God is going to ultimately judge the world because no one can see into the heart of man other than God. Only God is able to penetrate the heart of human beings and to know whether they're truly righteous or not. So that's something which God does not hand over to some human being to do on his behalf. And then he goes on to say that the proof that Jesus is this judge is that he was raised from the dead. So for Paul, we know that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that the resurrection of the dead, resurrection of Jesus from the dead, is the ultimate proof of the truth of Christianity. And he goes on to say that unless Jesus had been resurrected, all of the faith of all Christians is in vain. So for him, this is a big deal. And here's something that I find very peculiar, and I couldn't really find any Christian commentary that addresses this and gives any kind of answer, but it says that in verse 32, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, so when these Greeks heard of, I guess, the idea that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, some mocked, some thought the idea was loopy and strange, while others said, "We will hear you again on this matter." So in verse 32, some of his audience say, what you're saying is interesting, and we're willing to listen to more. But verse 33 says, so Paul departed from among them. Now, why would he do that? You would think that if they're, open to what he's saying and they're asking to hear more, that he would have stayed there and preached some more. So for some reason, in verse 33, we're told something that just doesn't make any sense, that after receiving this invitation to stay and explain to them more about his teachings, immediately Paul, so it should have said, so Paul continued to preach, right? The word "so" is sort of explaining what Paul does next, and we're told that he departed from them. He left. He leaves them hanging. So I don't understand that, and I really have not seen any attempt to explain Paul's behavior. So we'll have to. I would just leave this as a question.
Got it. Seems fair enough to me.
Unless maybe some of the listeners could suggest why Paul picks up and leaves at this point. And if I find anything else out, or I can come up with some explanation on my own, the only thing that would make sense is that maybe Paul didn't think they were sincere. Maybe even though they said, "Oh, we're really interested," maybe Paul was able to see through that and say, "Yeah, they're really interested. They're just mocking me." But the way that the text has it is that the text contrasts those who mocked to those who said, "No, we want to hear what you have to say." So I don't think these people were insincere, and I think that it's just strange that Paul does not continue to teach them. So, my good friend.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's been a nice 50. So, well, thank you, Rabbi. That was pretty awesome as usual. And so we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. 5-6 weeks. We'll see how that works out. Maybe before then, I might squeeze you in for a Torah Parsha if it works out that way. So
that would be cool.
That'd be kind of cool. Okay. All right. Well, that sounds great. Well, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for tuning in. The Heathrow. Shavua Tov, everyone. See you next time.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה